There's a specific type of silence that follows a cover-up. Not the absence of sound, but the hollow echo of truth being systematically erased. The hum of hard drives being degaussed. The chemical smell of photographs dissolving in acid baths. The soft click of filing cabinets being sealed and sent to storage facilities that don't officially exist. My name is Sarah Kovac. For 9 years, I worked as a field suppression specialist for an organization called the North American Wildlife Documentation Control Division, a subdivision of the Department of Interior that appears on no organizational charts and operates from offices with no exterior signage. Our job was simple. When evidence of unclassified cryptid species surfaced, we made it disappear. A trail camera photograph showing something that shouldn't exist? We retrieved the camera, replaced the memory card, compensated the owner for their equipment malfunction. A hiker's video going viral on social media. We contacted the platforms with federal preservation orders, had the content removed, and visited the uploader to explain the serious penalties for distributing classified wildlife documentation. Footprint casts, hair samples, eyewitness testimonies. All of it funneled through our protocols, sanitized, and filed away where it could never threaten the official narrative. I was very good at my job. Until March 2024, when one photograph slipped through my fingers and changed everything. The work was methodical, almost bureaucratic. People imagine cover-ups as dramatic. Men in black suits, intimidation tactics, conspiracy. The reality was paperwork, protocols, and process. Most cases came through automated monitoring systems. Our algorithms scanned social media, photography forums, wildlife reporting databases, even police incident reports. When flagged content appeared, images matching morphological parameters for unidentified hominids, audio with specific frequency signatures, eyewitness descriptions using key terminology, it triggered a response workflow. My territory covered Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. The Pacific Northwest was a hot zone, dense wilderness, low population density, and a cultural tradition of cryptid awareness that made evidence more common and more credible. I operated alone, using credentials that identified me as various federal agencies depending on what the situation required. Sometimes I was Fish and Wildlife investigating poaching, sometimes Forest Service, checking permit compliance, sometimes just a representative from a vague documentation review board, with enough official-looking paperwork to intimidate civilians into cooperation. The job attracted a specific personality type, detail-oriented, ethically flexible, comfortable with ambiguity and authorized deception. We weren't told why suppression was necessary, just that it was policy, that it protected both the public and the species involved, and that our work was essential to maintaining ecological stability. I believed that for 8 years. The cases followed patterns. Hikers photographing dark shapes through trees, usually bears, occasionally faked, very rarely something else. Audio recordings of unknown vocalizations that were almost always owls or elk or coyotes with acoustic distortion. Footprint casts that didn't match known species, most explainable through ground conditions, a few requiring more creative interpretation. But roughly 3 times per year, I'd encounter evidence I couldn't easily explain away. March 2024 started like any other case. An automated alert flagged a photograph uploaded to a wildlife photography forum by a user identified as Marcus Chen, posted from an IP address in Olympia, Washington. The image showed a figure partially obscured by Douglas fir branches, approximately 300 yards from the camera position, captured using a high-resolution telephoto lens. The suppression algorithm had flagged it for morphological anomalies, bipedal stance, estimated height exceeding human range, body proportions inconsistent with known North American mammals. Standard protocol: contact the poster, arrange a meeting, assess the image, retrieve the original file, provide compensation, and ensure deletion of all copies. I reached out to Marcus Chen through the forum's messaging system, identifying myself as a wildlife documentation specialist interested in discussing his photograph. He responded within 2 hours, eager to talk about what he'd captured. We met at a coffee shop in Olympia 3 days later. Marcus was in his mid-30s, an amateur nature photographer who spent weekends hiking and shooting wildlife in the Olympic Peninsula. Earnest, enthusiastic, and completely unprepared for what his photograph actually represented. "I was set up for elk," he explained, pulling out his laptop. "Pre-dawn position overlooking a meadow they frequent. But movement in the tree line caught my attention. Something large moving perpendicular to normal game trails. I tracked it through the telephoto and just started shooting. He opened the image file. My breath caught. This wasn't a blurred shape or ambiguous shadow. The resolution was exceptional. The lighting was early morning golden hour and the subject was clearly visible despite the partial tree cover. 8 feet tall, covered in dark auburn hair, massive shoulders, face turned slightly toward the camera showing clear facial structure, bipedal, intelligent posture, carrying what appeared to be a long branch, not dragging it, but carrying it with obvious intention. This was the clearest photographic evidence I'd seen in 9 years. I know it sounds crazy, Marcus continued, but I don't think that's a bear. The proportions are wrong. The way it moves, it's upright, balanced, and that branch, it's holding it like a tool. I maintained professional neutrality while my mind raced through protocols. This was category alpha evidence, clear, high resolution, demonstrating morphological and behavioral characteristics consistent with unclassified hominid presence. Standard procedure: retrieve all copies, ensure complete deletion, provide standard compensation of $5,000 for equipment malfunction and researcher time, have the photographer sign enhanced NDAs with federal penalty clauses. But something made me hesitate. Marcus, have you shown this to anyone else? Uploaded it anywhere besides the forum? No, just the one post. I wanted expert opinions before going wider with it. He looked at me hopefully. Do you think it's real? Do you think I actually photographed something unknown? The question hung between us. In 9 years, I'd had this conversation hundreds of times, and hundreds of times, I'd done my job, retrieved the evidence, explained it away, ensured silence. But this time, looking at undeniable proof of something I'd spent nearly a decade helping to hide, I found myself asking a different question. Why? Why was I suppressing evidence of a species that clearly existed? Who benefited from keeping it hidden? And what right did I have to decide that truth should be sacrificed to policy? I think you should hold on to this for now, I heard myself say. Don't share it publicly yet, but don't delete it either. I need to do some verification work on my end. Marcus looked surprised but nodded. Should I expect follow-up? Definitely. But Marcus? I met his eyes. Be very careful who you show this to. There are interests that prefer certain discoveries remain undocumented. I left the coffee shop with protocol violations already stacking up. The image burned into my memory, and a growing certainty that I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. I didn't report the Marcus Chen case through official channels. Instead, I filed a standard insufficient evidence for retrieval action report, claiming the image was too ambiguous for suppression priority. It was a lie that would hold up only until someone reviewed the actual photograph, which meant I had maybe a week before questions started. I spent that week doing something I'd never done before, investigating my own organization. The North American Wildlife Documentation Control Division operated from a nondescript office building in Arlington, Virginia. 53 employees total, structured into regional field teams and a central analysis unit. Our funding came through the Department of Interior, but was routed through enough bureaucratic layers to make auditing virtually impossible. I'd been recruited straight out of graduate school, where my thesis on information management in conservation contexts had apparently flagged me as suitable for specialized wildlife documentation work. The interview process had been extensive, the background checks invasive, and the pay substantially above market rate. 9 years of retrieving evidence, compensating witnesses, and ensuring that certain truths never reached public awareness. And in all that time, I'd never questioned the fundamental premise that suppression was necessary. But the Marcus Chen photograph changed something. Seeing undeniable proof of an intelligent, tool-using species existing in North American wilderness made the suppression feel less like protection and more like something else. Control, power, the preservation of a status quo that benefited someone. But who? I started digging through archived case files looking for patterns. What I found disturbed me more than the evidence itself. Over the past 15 years, my organization had suppressed approximately 1,947 cases of potential cryptid evidence across North America. Of those, roughly 400 were classified as Category Alpha, evidence showing clear morphological characteristics of unclassified hominid species. But suppression wasn't random. Certain geographic areas received disproportionate attention: the Pacific Northwest, the Appalachian Corridor, parts of Northern California and British Columbia, and within those areas, suppression intensity increased dramatically near specific locations. Federal land parcels under long-term ecological study, military testing ranges with restricted access, areas with ongoing mineral surveys or resource extraction negotiations. The pattern was clear. Evidence was suppressed most aggressively where it might interfere with commercial or governmental interests. We weren't protecting an unknown species. We were protecting economic and strategic priorities from the complication of acknowledging that species existed. I pulled location data from the Marcus Chen photograph and cross-referenced it with our suppression maps. The image had been captured in the Olympic National Forest, approximately 8 miles from a proposed mining survey area, currently under environmental review. If evidence of an unclassified intelligent species emerged in that region, it would trigger endangered species protections, environmental impact requirements, and potentially decades of legal challenges. The mining survey was worth an estimated $3.2 billion. Marcus Chen's photograph could kill the entire project. That's why it needed to disappear. I sat in my apartment surrounded by case files I'd smuggled home in violation of every security protocol, understanding for the first time that I hadn't been working in conservation. I'd been working in resource protection, ensuring that nature never interfered with profit. My phone rang. The caller ID showed my supervisor, Division Chief Patricia Hammond. Kovac, we need to discuss the Chen case from Olympic region. Your report indicates insufficient evidence, but our automated analysis flagged the image for immediate retrieval. Can you explain the discrepancy? They'd reviewed the photograph. My lie had lasted 4 days, not 7. I'm following up this week, I said, keeping my voice steady. The subject showed reluctance to cooperate. I'm building rapport for more effective voluntary compliance. Silence on the other end. Then, Sarah, you've been in the field for 9 years. You know our protocols don't include extended rapport building. Retrieve the evidence, execute standard suppression, and file complete documentation by end of week. Non-negotiable. Understood. And Sarah, if there's any difficulty with this case, any hesitation about executing your responsibilities, we need to know immediately. This isn't the assignment for developing ethical complications. The phrasing sent ice through my veins. They knew, or suspected. Either way, I was being watched. No complications, Chief, I'll handle it. I ended the call and immediately pulled the battery from my phone, a precaution that probably came too late but felt necessary anyway. I had 72 hours to retrieve Marcus Chen's photograph and ensure its complete destruction. If I didn't, my career was over and someone else would be assigned. Someone without doubts, without hesitation. Someone who wouldn't care that they were erasing proof of an intelligent species to protect mining interests. I opened my laptop and drafted an email to Marcus Chen. Don't trust anyone identifying themselves as federal wildlife authorities. Back up your photograph in multiple locations. And whatever you do, don't delete the original. Then I drafted a second email. This one to a journalist I'd met years ago during a college environmental advocacy project. Melissa Torres, now a senior investigative reporter at the Seattle Times, specializing in government accountability and environmental policy. The email contained 3 things: the Marcus Chen photograph, GPS coordinates, and a 3,000-word summary of suppression activities in the Pacific Northwest region, including the correlation between evidence retrieval and commercial resource interests. My finger hovered over the send button. Sending this would end my career, violate federal law, expose me to criminal prosecution, destroy the organizational structure I'd worked within for nearly a decade. But not sending it would mean continuing to erase evidence of a species that deserved protection, that deserved acknowledgement, that deserved to exist without being sacrificed to economic convenience. I hit send, both emails, simultaneously. Then I pulled my go bag from the closet, packed months ago in a moment of paranoid preparation I hadn't quite understood at the time, and left my apartment for the last time. Whatever came next, I was done erasing truth. Melissa Torres called me 6 hours after I sent the email. I was in a motel outside of Tacoma, using a burner phone purchased with cash, watching the door like someone expecting federal marshals at any moment. Sarah Kovac, this is Melissa Torres with the Seattle Times. I received your email. We need to talk in person. Are you alone? Yes, and I haven't shared this with anyone yet. But Sarah, if what you're describing is accurate, if there's a federal agency systematically suppressing evidence of cryptid species to protect commercial interests, this is massive. I need to verify everything before we publish. Publishing will make you a target. I've been a target before. Can we meet? We arranged a location, a public park in Seattle, open space with good sight lines. I arrived 2 hours early and watched for surveillance. Melissa arrived exactly on time, alone, carrying a shoulder bag that could contain recording equipment or just normal journalist supplies. She was early 40s, confident bearing, eyes that assessed everything twice. We sat on a bench overlooking Puget Sound. "Show me your credentials," she said immediately. I handed her my federal ID, still valid for another 18 hours probably. She photographed it, checked the holographic security features and nodded. "Okay, now convince me this isn't an elaborate hoax." I pulled out a tablet loaded with encrypted files, case reports, suppression protocols, the correlation analysis I'd completed, and 47 additional photographs from other cases. Clear images, detailed documentation, geographic patterns that couldn't be coincidental. Melissa reviewed everything in silence, her expression shifting from skepticism to shock to cold professional focus. "How many species?" she asked finally. "We think one, possibly two distinct populations. The morphological variations could indicate regional adaptation rather than separate species. But the intelligence level is consistent. Tool use, territorial awareness, active camera avoidance, possible linguistic capacity." Linguistic? Audio evidence suggests structured vocalizations with consistent phonemic patterns. It's been suppressed like everything else, but the analysis exists in classified files. And your organization has been hiding this for how long? At least 15 years that I can document. Probably longer. Melissa closed the tablet. Why come forward now? 9 years you've been part of this. The question I'd been asking myself constantly. Because I saw a photograph that was too clear to rationalize. And I realized I'd stopped asking whether suppression was right and started only asking whether it was effective. I looked out at the water. I don't know if that makes me better or just complicit for longer. It makes you a whistleblower, which means you're about to become very unpopular with very powerful people. She opened her bag and pulled out a digital recorder. "I'm going to need everything. Every case, every protocol, every piece of evidence you can provide. And I'll need you on record. They'll destroy me. Probably. But they'll destroy you anyway for sending me that email. At least this way, you control the narrative." She set the recorder between us. "Sarah Kovac, for the record. Tell me about the North American Wildlife Documentation Control Division and what it's been hiding." I talked for 3 hours. Every case I could remember. The suppression protocols. The geographic patterns linking evidence removal to commercial interests. The photographs and audio recordings that proved an intelligent species existed in North American wilderness and had been deliberately erased from public knowledge. Melissa documented everything, asking sharp questions, demanding specifics, building a case that could withstand legal challenge. "When can you publish?" I asked when we'd finished. 48 hours. I need to verify independently, get legal review, and prepare for the response. This will trigger federal investigations, probably congressional hearings, and definitely lawsuits. She stood, gathering her materials. "You should disappear for a few days. Once this hits, everyone will be looking for you. Where should I go?" She smiled grimly. "Somewhere federal agents won't think to look. And Sarah, thank you. This is the kind of truth that needs to exist, whatever the cost." She left me sitting alone, watching evening settle over the Sound, knowing that within 2 days the world would know what I'd been hiding. That night, my former supervisor Patricia Hammond called my burner number, which should have been impossible unless they were tracking me through methods I didn't want to think about. "Sarah, we can still contain this. Meet with me tomorrow morning. No consequences, no charges. We'll call it a psychological crisis, get you help and move forward." "You mean bury it?" "I mean protect you from making a catastrophic mistake. That journalist will publish something sensational and irresponsible. Your career will be destroyed. You'll face federal charges. And nothing will change. We'll continue our work with or without you. But people will know. They'll know these species exist. They'll know someone claims they exist based on ambiguous evidence and the word of a disgruntled former employee. Sarah, you're smarter than this. You know how information warfare works." Her voice softened. "Come in. Let us help you." "I'm done erasing truth for convenience, Patricia." "Then you're done being protected by us. Good luck out there." The line went dead. I checked into a different motel, paid cash, and waited for the Seattle Times to publish the story that would end everything. The story hit on a Thursday morning. Federal agency suppressed evidence of unidentified hominid species for economic benefit. Melissa Torres's byline, 2,300 words. The Marcus Chen photograph featured prominently, along with redacted versions of suppression protocols and my testimony as a named source. Within 3 hours, it had been picked up by national outlets. By noon, it was trending globally. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Wildlife organizations demanded investigations. Congressional representatives called for hearings. Environmental groups filed emergency petitions to halt development projects in the affected areas. And social media exploded with debates about government transparency, species protection, and what else might be hidden. The Department of Interior issued a denial within 6 hours. No such agency exists. The claims are based on fabricated documents and unreliable testimony from an individual with documented mental health concerns. They'd pivoted to character assassination faster than I'd expected. By evening, my name was attached to phrases like conspiracy theorist and fabricating evidence and currently under psychiatric evaluation, none of which were true but all of which were impossible to disprove quickly. Melissa called with updates throughout the day. They're hitting you hard. Leaked medical records showing anxiety medication. Legal to prescribe, but they're spinning it as instability. Claims you were terminated for performance issues. An anonymous colleague saying you'd become obsessed with cryptozoology and unable to distinguish fantasy from protocol. How do we counter it? We don't. We let them overplay their hand. Because I've got 3 more sources now. Former employees of your division who saw my story and are willing to corroborate. And more importantly, Marcus Chen went public with his raw image files and metadata. Professional photographers are analyzing it. The consensus so far, it's genuine, unmanipulated, and shows something that doesn't match any known North American species. That was the leverage point. My testimony could be dismissed as unreliable, but photographic evidence verified by independent experts was harder to suppress. What do you need from me? I asked. Stay invisible for now. They'll be looking for you, not just your former agency, but others who have interests in keeping this quiet. If they can force you into a situation where you're arrested or hospitalized, they control the narrative. But if you stay free and we keep producing verifiable evidence, they lose. I spent the next week moving between cheap motels, using cash, avoiding patterns. My former colleagues, people I'd worked with for years, appeared on news programs defending the agency and dismissing the allegations. Their statements were carefully scripted, emphasizing the lack of credible evidence and the unreliable nature of the source. But cracks were forming. A Forest Service ranger in Oregon came forward with testimony about being pressured to misidentify footprint evidence. A wildlife biologist in Northern California described having research permits revoked after reporting unusual hominid behaviors. A former Department of Interior official admitted that certain wildlife documentation had been classified for national security reasons without clear justification. Each new source added weight to the story, and each one painted a clearer picture. Suppression wasn't limited to my division. It was systematic, coordinated across multiple agencies, and had been ongoing for decades. On day 9, Marcus Chen appeared on national television with his photograph and a simple statement, "I know what I photographed. And I know that powerful interests don't want us asking questions about what lives in our remaining wilderness. But I'm not deleting this, and I'm not staying silent." The interview went viral. Within 24 hours, "What Are They Hiding?" was trending, and demands for congressional investigation intensified. My former supervisor, Patricia Hammond, agreed to testify before a House Oversight Committee, under subpoena, after initially refusing. I watched her testimony from a motel room in Portland. She was professional, composed, and utterly convincing in her denials. The North American Wildlife Documentation Control Division is a legitimate research documentation agency focused on cataloging and preserving evidence of wildlife populations. We have never suppressed evidence of cryptid species because no such evidence exists. What Ms. Kovac has described is a gross mischaracterization of routine conservation work, filtered through personal instability and ideological bias. It was a masterful performance, and it might have worked if the committee hadn't produced the next witness, Dr. Martin Voss, a former genetics researcher who'd worked with tissue samples collected by my division. I was asked to analyze hair samples designated as unidentified North American mammal, Dr. Voss testified. The DNA analysis showed a hominid genome, closest relation to Homo sapiens, but with distinct variations suggesting a divergent evolutionary lineage. When I reported these findings, I was told to destroy the samples and falsify my report to indicate contamination. When I refused, my contract was terminated, and I was required to sign an NDA under threat of federal prosecution. He submitted the original analysis, genetic data showing an unclassified hominid species existing in North America. The hearing room erupted. Patricia Hammond's composure cracked for just a moment, long enough for cameras to catch the flash of panic before she recovered. But the damage was done. The genetic evidence corroborated everything I'd claimed. By that evening, the Department of Interior announced a full internal investigation. My former division was placed on administrative suspension, and federal prosecutors began reviewing potential criminal charges against officials who'd participated in the suppression. Melissa called with the update, "You did it. The story's holding. They can't suppress it anymore. What happens to the species now? To the populations we've been hiding? That's the next battle. Environmental groups are already filing for emergency endangered species protections. Congress is drafting legislation for cryptid conservation frameworks, and scientists are demanding access to the habitat areas for legitimate research, all of which means more human presence, more disturbance, more threat to creatures that have survived precisely because they've remained hidden." Melissa was quiet for a moment. "You're right. We're trading one problem for another, but at least now they'll have legal protection. At least now we're acknowledging they exist. I hope that's enough, but I wasn't sure it would be." 3 weeks after the story broke, I received an encrypted message through a secure channel Melissa had set up for whistleblower communications. The sender identified themselves only as Cascade Research Collective, a name I didn't recognize but which carried an implicit suggestion of scientific legitimacy. The message was brief. "We need to talk about what happens next. You exposed the suppression, but you didn't solve the underlying problem. Meet us if you want to actually protect what you've revealed." I ran it past Melissa, who researched the group and found almost nothing. A few academic papers published under the name, mentions in environmental forums, but no official organization, no physical address, no identifiable leadership. "Could be a trap," she said. "Your former agency trying to draw you out. Or it could be people who actually understand the stakes." The message included a meeting location, a trailhead in the North Cascades 3 days from now. "No electronic devices. Come alone." Against every instinct for self-preservation, I went. The trailhead was empty when I arrived at dawn. I hiked in 2 miles, following cairns that marked a path barely visible through the underbrush. At a small clearing beside a mountain stream, 3 people waited. 2 women and 1 man, all in their 40s or 50s, dressed in hiking gear that looked well-used rather than performative. One of the women stepped forward. "Ms. Kovac, thank you for coming. I'm Dr. Elena Voss, field biologist, though that's not what brought me here. This is Dr. James Okonkwo, computational linguist, and Catherine Ward, conservation legal specialist." The names meant nothing to me. We represent a network of researchers, advocates, and former government personnel who've been working to protect uncontacted intelligent species for over 2 decades. Dr. Voss continued. "What you've exposed, the suppression apparatus, is only part of the picture. The question now is what comes next." "Legal protection," I said. "Endangered species designation, habitat preservation. That's what should come next. That's what will invite exactly the attention these populations can't survive," Catherine Ward interjected. "Legal protection requires documentation, scientific study, population surveys, habitat mapping. It means bringing researchers, bureaucrats, and eventually tourists into areas that have remained safe precisely because they were ignored. So what's the alternative? Keep them hidden? We just spent weeks fighting against suppression." "We fought against suppression for commercial benefit," Dr. Voss corrected. "That's different from strategic protection. What we're proposing is careful, limited acknowledgement paired with aggressive habitat protection that doesn't require proving these populations exist in specific locations." James Okonkwo spread a map on a flat rock. It showed the Pacific Northwest with overlaid zones marked in different colors. Red zones are areas with confirmed unclassified hominid populations. Yellow zones are probable habitats based on evidence patterns. Green zones are buffer areas with no population but strategic importance for movement corridors. He pointed to several red zones. "Your suppression work, and the work of your division over 15 years, has actually created an accidental protected network. By removing evidence from public knowledge, you've kept these areas off the radar for development, tourism, and intensive human activity. We're not suggesting you did the right thing, Catherine added quickly, seeing my expression. The motivations were corrupt and the methods were unethical, but the outcome was functional. These populations survived in anonymity. Now that anonymity is gone, so we need a new strategy. What strategy? Dr. Voss pulled out a document. Broad habitat protection without species-specific justification. We push for expansion of existing wilderness areas, logging restrictions and development limitations based on ecological diversity rather than cryptid presence. We create legal protection zones that happen to encompass red zone areas without ever officially acknowledging why. That's still suppression, just better-intentioned suppression. No, Dr. Voss said firmly. It's the difference between hiding truth for profit and managing truth for survival. These populations are small, genetically vulnerable, and have survived this long only through extreme caution and human avoidance. Full exposure would bring researchers, media, trophy hunters, and curiosity seekers into their territories. Most wouldn't mean harm, but the cumulative impact would be devastating. I thought about the Marcus Chen photograph, the image that had started everything. The clear, high-resolution evidence that an intelligent species existed in North American wilderness. So what do you want from me? We want you to help us navigate what comes next, Catherine said. Congressional hearings, legal frameworks, scientific access. You have credibility now as the person who exposed suppression. Use that credibility to advocate for protection models that don't require proof of presence. Argue for ecosystem-based conservation rather than species-specific documentation. And Marcus Chen's photograph is already out there and can't be erased. But it's one photograph from one location. We make sure it stays singular. Acknowledge the possibility without confirming locations, populations, or specific habitats. Let mystery be part of the protection. Dr. Voss sat down on a fallen log, looking tired suddenly. Sarah, I've been doing this work for 15 years. I've tracked populations, documented evidence, and spent most of my career hiding what I found because exposing it would destroy it. What you did, going public, was brave. But bravery without strategy can cause more harm than good. Help us finish what you started, but finish it right. I looked at the three of them, people who'd been protecting these populations through obscurity, while I'd been doing it through suppression. Different methods, same goal. If I do this, I'm still lying. Just more carefully. You're choosing which truths to prioritize, James corrected. The truth that intelligent species exist? That's out now, because of you. The truth of exactly where they are and how to find them. That stays protected, not for corporate benefit, but for their survival. I thought about 9 years of erasing evidence, about Patricia Hammond's testimony, about Marcus Chen's photograph changing everything and nothing. I'll help, I said finally, but on one condition: no more complete suppression. If evidence emerges, we don't erase it. We manage it, contextualize it, but we don't pretend it doesn't exist. Agreed, Doctor, Voss said immediately. Truth acknowledged, details protected. Can you live with that? I don't know, but I'll try. We spent the next 4 hours reviewing their network. 17 confirmed populations across North America, each with habitat protection strategies that operated through proxies and misdirection, rather than direct acknowledgement. By the time I hiked back out, I understood that exposure and protection weren't opposites. They were variables that required constant, careful balancing. The congressional hearings lasted 6 weeks. I testified twice, once about the suppression apparatus I'd been part of, and again about conservation strategies for unclassified species. My testimony in the second hearing was carefully calibrated with input from Dr. Voss's network. Acknowledgement of existence doesn't require documentation of location, I told the House Committee on Natural Resources. We can provide legal protections for habitat corridors without specifying which species we're protecting or where they're concentrated. Broad ecosystem preservation achieves conservation goals without creating maps for exploitation. Representative Jenkins from Washington pushed back. But how do we justify budget allocations for protecting something we can't prove exists in specific locations? The American people deserve transparency about where their tax dollars go. The American people also deserve wilderness areas that remain wild. Not every conservation decision needs to be justified through documentation that inevitably leads to degradation. I pulled up a map showing the Olympic Peninsula. This region has value for its ecological diversity, its old-growth forests, its watershed protection, Whether or not it also supports unclassified hominid populations shouldn't be the determining factor in whether we preserve it. It was strategic ambiguity, acknowledging possibility without confirming specifics, and it was working slowly. Environmental organizations began adopting similar language. Wildlife advocates pushed for protection zones justified through ecosystem services rather than specific species presence, and legal frameworks started emerging that protected habitat without requiring proof of occupancy. But not everyone was satisfied with ambiguity. Private research consortiums petitioned for scientific access to probable habitats. Documentary filmmakers sought permits for expedition filming. And worst of all, trophy hunting organizations argued that if the species existed, it should be subject to managed hunting protocols like any other large North American mammal. The backlash was inevitable, but horrifying. We're treating these creatures like myths that need protection from verification, argued Dr. Thomas Yardley, the same researcher who'd pushed for enhanced interrogation protocols in my former division. Science requires observation, documentation, and study. Hiding behind vague habitat protection is intellectual cowardice. He appeared on news programs, in academic journals, in congressional testimony, building a case that exposure was necessary for legitimate scientific understanding. And he had legitimate points. We were protecting through obscurity, limiting knowledge, making decisions about information access that affected public understanding of natural history. The debate fractured the scientific community. Conservation biologists lined up on both sides. Some argued that protection required proof of presence, that habitat preservation without species confirmation wouldn't survive budget cycles and political changes. Others maintained that documentation would inevitably lead to exploitation. That mystery was a legitimate conservation tool. I found myself in the middle, the whistleblower who'd exposed suppression now being accused of advocating for continued hiding. "You can't have it both ways, Ms. Kovac," a journalist challenged me during an interview. "Either transparency matters, or it doesn't. Either we acknowledge and document these populations, or we admit you were right to suppress evidence in the first place. There's a difference between suppressing for corporate profit and protecting for survival," I responded. "We acknowledge these species exist, that's transparency. But demanding to know exactly where they are and how to find them, that's not transparency. That's entitlement to access beings that have clearly chosen to avoid us." The interview went viral, praised by some as ethical clarity and criticized by others as paternalistic gatekeeping. Marcus Chen reached out privately during this period. "I don't regret publishing my photograph," he said over encrypted messaging. "But I've had 17 requests for the exact location, offers up to $50,000 for GPS coordinates, and 3 death threats from people who think I'm part of a government conspiracy. I'm starting to understand why your agency suppressed evidence. Do you wish you'd never taken the picture?" Long pause. "No, but I wish the world was different. That proof of something remarkable didn't automatically make it a target. That was the core tension. Discovery and protection were fundamentally opposed when the thing discovered was rare, intelligent, and vulnerable." 6 weeks after my testimony, Congress passed the Wilderness Intelligence Protection Act, a compromise framework that provided federal funding for habitat preservation in areas showing potential for unclassified hominid populations, without requiring definitive proof. It was protection through plausible deniability, and it was the best outcome we could achieve. Dr. Voss's network celebrated it as a victory. Dr. Yardley and his colleagues denounced it as pseudoscientific mysticism, and I recognized it for what it was: imperfect, incomplete, but possibly enough to give these populations a chance at survival. The populations themselves remained hidden, still avoiding cameras, still evading definitive documentation, still choosing obscurity over discovery, exactly as they should. 8 months after the Seattle Times article published, I returned to the Olympic Peninsula, not as a suppression agent, not as a whistleblower, just as someone who needed to see the landscape I'd spent 9 years protecting through erasure and now protected through strategic ambiguity. I hiked to the area where Marcus Chen had captured his photograph, coordinates I'd memorized from the case file but never publicly disclosed. The trail was overgrown, showing minimal human traffic. Good. That meant the location hadn't become a destination despite the publicity. At the meadow's edge where Marcus had positioned his camera, I sat on a fallen log and waited, not looking for anything, just being present in a space I'd affected from distance for so long. 3 hours passed, wind through Douglas firs, the distant call of ravens, water moving over stones somewhere deeper in the forest. Then, at the tree line, roughly where Marcus's photograph had been taken, movement. A figure, large, dark, partially obscured by branches but unmistakably there. It stood watching me from approximately 300 yards, the same distance as the original photograph, far enough for safety, close enough to acknowledge presence. We stayed like that for several minutes. Me on my log, it in the shadows. Two beings occupying the same space with fundamentally different stakes and remaining hidden. I pulled out my phone, against my better judgment, against everything I'd argued for, and looked at it. No signal this deep in the wilderness, but the camera still worked. One photograph, high resolution, clear documentation, proof that Marcus Chen's image wasn't singular, that the population persisted, that intelligent hominids definitely existed in this specific location, evidence that would validate everything I'd claimed, that would end doubt, that would make my testimony unquestionable, and that would paint a target on this exact spot. The figure in the tree line remained motionless, watching, waiting to see what I would do. I turned off the phone without taking the picture. Then I did something that felt absurd and necessary. I raised one hand in a gesture of acknowledgement. Not threat, not claim, just recognition of shared presence. The figure shifted, barely visible movement that could have been anything or nothing. But I chose to interpret it as response, as mutual recognition that some encounters don't require documentation. It melted back into forest darkness with silence that defied its size, leaving me alone with the certainty that I'd made the right choice. Truth didn't always require proof. Sometimes witnessing was enough. I hiked out as afternoon light filtered through the canopy, understanding finally that my 9 years of suppression and 8 months of exposure had both been preparing me for this moment, choosing silence not from fear or corporate interest, but from respect. I never returned to federal employment. The Department of Interior offered a settlement, cleared legal exposure in exchange for permanent confidentiality about operational details. I accepted not because I feared prosecution, but because the remaining classified information served legitimate protection purposes. Some secrets deserved to stay hidden. My former division was restructured and renamed, its protocols revised to emphasize documentation rather than suppression. Whether that change is meaningful or just cosmetic remains to be seen. Several of my former colleagues faced disciplinary action. Patricia Hammond was quietly reassigned to a desk position with no field authority, and the officials who'd coordinated suppression with commercial interests are currently under federal investigation, though I'm not optimistic about accountability. Marcus Chen became an advocate for wilderness protection, using his photograph not to enable discovery, but to argue for preservation. He speaks at conferences, writes articles, and carefully never discloses exact locations. He understood, eventually, what I took 9 years to learn. Some things are more important than proof. I work now with Dr. Voss's network, the Cascade Research Collective, which turns out to be a coalition of about 40 researchers, advocates, and former government personnel across North America. We operate in legal gray areas, protecting populations through strategic information management rather than suppression. It's not perfect. We still make decisions about what information reaches public awareness and what stays carefully obscured. We still act as gatekeepers, determining who can be trusted with knowledge and who represents threat. But we do it for survival rather than profit, and we acknowledge the ethical complexity rather than pretending it doesn't exist. The populations we protect remain elusive, still avoiding definitive documentation, still choosing obscurity, still surviving in the margins of human awareness, exactly as they should. I think sometimes about the figure at the tree line, watching me choose not to photograph it. I wonder if it understood, if it recognized a human making a decision that prioritized its safety over her validation. Probably not. It likely just saw another primate in its territory and waited for me to leave. But I choose to believe otherwise. I choose to believe that intelligence recognizes respect, that consciousness acknowledges restraint, that choosing not to document can be its own form of witness. The Marcus Chen photograph remains the clearest evidence publicly available, reproduced in articles, analyzed by experts, cited in legal proceedings. One image from one moment, frozen in time. It's enough to prove existence without mapping vulnerability, enough to justify protection without enabling exploitation, enough to change the conversation without ending the mystery. People still ask me if I regret exposing the suppression apparatus, if I think transparency was worth the complications it created. My answer is always the same. I regret the 9 years I spent erasing truth. I don't regret the 8 months I spent exposing that erasure. And I don't regret the work I do now, protecting through strategic ambiguity rather than complete suppression. The world knows now that intelligent hominids exist in North American wilderness. That's the truth that matters. Where exactly they are, how many remain, what their social structures look like. Those are details that serve curiosity rather than conservation. And sometimes curiosity needs to be unsatisfied for survival.